321 Oakland Center. Climb and maintain flight level 220.
Oakland Center, King Air 321, leaving 5,000 for flight level 220.
We were going from Palmdale to Santa Cruz. It was a November day.
Routine flight, one we've made many times. There was some weather over the mountains, but it's a nice equipped plane, right? So we got the clearance for 22,000 feet, but as we were climbing through 15, we started to pick up some ice.
At about 15,000 feet, we started to pick up some ice, so we decided to level out at 16 and try to stay clean. We were completely IMC.
We went completely IMC. Airspeed was 180 knots, vertical speed was 0, prop RPM was 1,700, and engine torques were 1,800 pounds. Autopilot was engaged and holding altitude.
We were still getting ice, just a trace at first, but inboard of the nacelle, where there's no boot, the ice was starting to show up.
We cruised about 5 minutes monitoring the ice buildup, cycling the boots as required. Engine instruments looked good. Autopilot was engaged and holding altitude. I figured it'd be a smooth ride. I watched the ice build and cycle the boots.
A bunch of ice broke away, but not all of it cleared completely.
Propeller ice would occasionally shed, hitting the fuselage. It'd vibrate on the buildup, then stop after the ice shed.
It was building on the wings too, and we were flying a little more nose high, though I didn't really realize why.
We were flying a little nose high, but can't tell you why. I didn't notice it as a problem. I guess I was dumb and happy.
Maybe ready to get home?
Suddenly there was a lot of vibration and buffeting. At first I thought more propeller ice, but it got more intense.
We were thinking more propeller ice.
And at the time, neither of us recognized it as stall buffet.
We advanced the propeller controls, the props increased.
We pushed the props up to about 2,000 RPM. I thought that would help clear the prop ice, but our problems were about to get worse. I finally looked at the airspeed, 115 knots. How'd we get there from 180? At the same instant, the left wing dropped.
Then the autopilot disconnected and we rolled. We went about 90 degrees.
What you have just seen is based on a true story. A King Air carrying passengers was flying over the Tehachapis, and through complacency, the autopilot trimmed the aircraft to stall in icing conditions. This training aid is intended to help pilots understand the phenomenon of tail, plane, and wing stall while flying in icing conditions. The training will also explain icing certification rules, and it will recommend cockpit procedures to mitigate ice-induced stall in order to maintain controlled flight during unexpected icing encounters. Much has occurred since NASA's original 1998 ice-contaminated tailplane stall video. This film updates that training, specifically addressing the reality that for the past 30 years, most icing accidents were caused by wing stall versus tail stall. The FAA wants to make pilots aware that vigilance is necessary to avoid the low-speed stall accidents that occur in icing, especially with the autopilot engaged. Because of these accidents, the FAA is leading a rule-making effort to both update training for wing stall recognition and recovery and to cover procedures while operating in icing conditions. Pilots need to be aware that the majority of the general aviation fleet, including previously icing certified airplanes, may not be certified to the latest standards. This means that an airplane's susceptibility to ice-contaminated tailplane stall may not be known. It also means that the stall warning system may not activate prior to wing stall in icing. In order to revise icing certification standards, the FAA has searched icing-related non-fatal incidents dating back 25 years for precursors to accidents and has found evidence of stall events during flight in icing conditions in which the stall warning system did not activate. This was found on many different airplane models.
Ice-induced stall has occurred in cruise, on approach, and during the landing phase of flight. In some of these events, the pilots attributed shudder or buffet to turbulence, engine roughness, or to propeller icing, but not to an impending wing stall. The FAA believes that many icing incidents and accidents follow a similar path.
I finally looked at the airspeed, 115 knots. How'd we get there from 180? At that same instant, the left wing dropped.
We went about 90 degrees. My recollection is to the right, but it was to the left.
The artificial horizon was half blue, half black. The directional gyro showed us turning. I pushed the yoke forward and applied maximum power and worked the rudder.
Just a tiny sliver of blue crescent was visible, and the blue slowly moved up.
The gyro showed us turning. The vertical speed indicator was down about 3,000 feet per minute. I expected to feel G's, but didn't. And no stall horn.
I thought maybe the stall horn had iced over, or maybe the ice-covered wing didn't trigger the horn. Either way, it didn't sound. I'm not exactly sure when we recovered, but the ice cleared at just below 11,000 feet and we leveled out at 10.
Must have been warmer below, so I got control of the plane at about 11,000 and leveled out at 10. I apologized to the passengers for the excitement and attributed it to prop icing. But I know now that we had a wing stall due to ice and complacency, my complacency. I don't know how I missed it. You'd expect that it could manage a little ice, but it didn't. Not that day.
A pilot hearing about icing encounters may be left asking, how can an airplane stall without any stall warning? Or how does an airplane equipped with ice protection systems get into trouble during icing conditions? Or even, why is the pilot flying into an icing cloud at all? The simple answer is icing happens. And sometimes when all precautions are adhered to, an icing encounter is unavoidable. Before describing the effects of ice on wing stall, it may be helpful to explain how small airplanes have been certified for flight in icing.
Prior to 1973, small airplanes and turboprop airplanes with boots were approved for flight in icing if they were equipped with a minimum suite of ice protection equipment. No actual testing in icing conditions was required. According to the certification standards of that time, the airplane could be flown in light icing but had to limit time in moderate icing. Many of these airplanes remain in the fleet today, operating under Parts 91 and 135. The icing certification on other models was removed via airworthiness directives based on their adverse icing service history.
After 1973, airplanes had to demonstrate safe operation in cloud icing conditions. These conditions are known as Part 25 Appendix C conditions. Safe operation, however, was not defined until 1993, when the small airplane certification rules were amended once again. Your AFM is the best source for you as a pilot to determine if your aircraft is certified for or prohibited from flight into known icing. But your AFM won't tell you what testing was done or what certification standards your plane was built under. Even if your aircraft is brand new, don't assume that it has been tested to the most current standards. If the aircraft type was certificated under CAR 3, then the standards of that certification are the ones met by that aircraft, even when you buy a brand new plane right off the line. Susceptibility to ice-contaminated tailplane stall was not tested on new icing-certified airplanes until 1994. From 1973 until the year 2000, a clear and unambiguous buffet was accepted for stall warning in icing conditions, even when the airplane was equipped with a stall warning system and a heated stall warning sensor. It wasn't until the year 2000 that stall warning systems, if installed, were shown to provide adequate stall warning with critical ice along the entire span of the wing. This animation shows how ice often affects the coefficient of lift for an airfoil. When flying at cruise speeds, at very low angles of attack, ice on the wing may have little effect on the coefficient of lift. However, pilots should be aware that the maximum coefficient of lift can be significantly reduced by the ice and the angle of attack at which it occurs, which means the stall angle is greatly reduced. So, when slowing down, the pilot may find that ice on the wing, which had little effect on lift in cruise, now causes stall to occur at a significantly lower angle of attack and higher airspeed than a non-iced wing. Ice that accumulates on pneumatic de-icing boots or between boot cycles, called residual ice, can increase stall speed significantly as well. It doesn't matter what type of wing airfoil you have. Recent certification work shows that the stall speed can increase by as much as 20 knots for a typical small airplane, even with a certified ice protection system. These stall curves show that the stall warning system would have to enunciate at a substantially lower angle of attack to function effectively in icing conditions. The stall warning systems do this on airplanes certified after the year 2000. Pilots should also note that with ice on the wings, a heated stall warning vane by itself does not ensure that adequate stall warning will be provided to the pilot. One of the first signs of performance degradation caused by ice is an increase in drag. This can be observed during cruise by a need for more power than is typically used for a particular speed. An increase in drag will also decrease climb performance. Because no requirements for climb performance in icing conditions existed prior to 1993, icing accidents involving small airplanes, especially those not certified for flight in icing, were often caused by a wing stall while trying to climb out of icing at altitudes above 10,000 feet. This is still an issue today.
Another way icing can affect the aerodynamics of an aircraft happens when ice forms on a horizontal stabilizer, triggering loss of lift at the tail. Back in 1995 through 1997, NASA did a tailplane icing program using the Twin Otter, which resulted in the tailplane icing video that this training video replaces. A follow-on program in 2001 was done on a Twin Otter, which investigated both the wing and tail stall by application of ice shapes on both the wing and tail leading edges. This was a great opportunity for me. On the same flight, I was able to experience both types of stalls and the recovery techniques. While we describe the tail stall phenomena in this training video, we've learned that since about the year 2000, that tail stalls within the current operating fleet are very rare. Still, for those airplanes that may be susceptible, it is important to understand the difference between a wing and tail stall, and when you might expect them to occur.
This animation illustrates the tail stall phenomenon. The center of gravity of an airplane is almost always forward of the wing's center of lift. The forces acting at these 2 points cause a nose-down pitching moment, which must be counteracted by the horizontal tail. When the flaps are extended, several things happen simultaneously. The wing center of lift moves aft, creating a larger nose-down pitching moment that the horizontal stabilizer must overcome. The tail angle of attack increases. This is due to the increased wing downwash, which naturally generates more downward lift by the tail.
Consequently, the flap extension drives the horizontal stabilizer closer toward its stalling angle. On some airplanes, application of full power when the flaps are deployed can also induce tail stall. Symptoms on most airplanes may be subtle. A lightening of the controls may be felt. There may also be difficulty trimming the airplane. Pilot-induced oscillations may be experienced.
If these symptoms are experienced after the flaps have been fully deployed and there is ice on the airplane, a tail stall is imminent. The pilot should firmly hold the yoke to prevent a pitch over, and then gradually raise the flaps to a setting and manage speed to where these symptoms are not present. Land with reduced flap setting if permitted within AFM. If the tail fully stalls, there will be a sudden forward stick pulse, possibly very strong. The nose of the aircraft will suddenly pitch down. In this extreme case, the corrective action is to pull the yoke back enough to regain control of the pitch attitude, reduce flap setting, and on some aircraft, ease off on power. This recovery is the opposite of a wing stall, so it is absolutely critical to sense the cues, know the airplane configuration and speed to distinguish a wing stall from a tail stall, and then perform the right corrective action.
Remember, full flap or near full flap deflection is needed to cause a tail stall. If flaps are not deployed, you are not experiencing a tail stall. Since 1994, all new icing-certified aircraft have been tested for ice-contaminated tailplane stall susceptibility. Many have been shown to not be susceptible. In those airplanes that were susceptible, tailplane stall occurred only with full flap deflection or with full flap deflection combined with takeoff power.
In those cases, operational limitations were placed in the AFM to ensure safe margins. In these airplanes, you must follow your AFM limitations and procedures on maximum flap setting in icing. To manage icing situations properly, you must determine if your airplane has been evaluated for ice-contaminated tailplane stall. If you are a commercial operator, contact your principal operations inspector. They have access to a proprietary database containing this information as described in FAA Notice 8900.267. If you are a general aviation pilot, look up your airplane on the Type Certificate Data Sheet, or TCDS, on the FAA website at www.faa.gov to determine when your airplane was certified. If your airplane was certified prior to 1994, unless it was modified after 1994 to add icing certification, you can assume that it was not evaluated for ice-contaminated tailplane stall. Contact your airplane manufacturer for additional information.
The FAA has made the following recommendations for flying in icing conditions based on NASA tail stall research and on years of certification flight test experience on numerous airplane models. If your airplane has been evaluated for ice-contaminated tailplane stall, certified after 1994, follow the AFM limitations and procedures, paying attention to maximum flap settings, if any, and to minimum speeds for icing conditions. When doing this, there is no ice-contaminated tailplane stall to worry about. You should treat buffet as impending wing stall and perform wing stall recovery procedures that include lowering the nose. Treat uncommanded motion or control anomalies as impending wing stall and perform wing stall recovery procedures that include lowering the nose. Treat any stall warning system enunciation as wing stall. Recovery should emphasize a reduction in wing angle of attack. If your airplane has not been evaluated for ice-contaminated tailplane stall, assume this if your airplane was certified in 1994 and earlier. Treat any stall warning system enunciation as a wing stall. If the field length permits, land with flaps less than full. If your AFM has no minimum speeds for icing, increase your speed by 15% to account for ice accretion. Check and use your manufacturer recommended approach speeds for using less than full flaps. Estimate that your landing distance will increase by 30% for every 15% increase in landing speed. Treat uncommanded motion or control anomalies as a wing stall. If you must land with full flaps or with a tail ice protection system failure, treat buffet either as a wing stall or tail stall using the following guidelines, noting that airspeed awareness is critical. Slow equals wing stall. Configure early in approach to provide recovery margin should it be needed. If autopilot is engaged, check your airspeed. It is most likely a wing stall. If you are maneuvering and there is no recent full flap extension or maximum power increase, it is most likely a wing stall. If you experience a loss of lateral control or roll oscillations, it is most likely a wing stall. If you just extended flaps to full settings, or you just applied maximum power with flaps at full settings, and you experience an uncommanded pitch down, or an apparent loss or reduction of pitch control, you are most likely experiencing tail stall, apply tail stall recovery procedures. On airplanes with stick pushers, remember the stick pusher activation looks like an uncommanded pitch down, but still indicates a wing stall. Airspeed awareness is critical. Slow equals stall. If you must climb to exit icing conditions, fly at or above your airplane's minimum airspeed for icing. Don't rely on the stall warning to keep you safe. Consult your AFM limitations under Procedures and Performance for climbing in icing conditions. If there are no limitations for climbing, consider the climb performance of the airplane and the minimum vectoring altitude when determining your route. Plan for exit strategies during your pre-flight planning.
Don't assume you can climb with ice on your airplane. Climb performance is degraded, sometimes significantly in icing conditions. Only consider climbing when ice first starts to build up on the airplane. Otherwise, descend to get out of the ice. Never fly below the minimum airspeed in icing. If you can't maintain at least the minimum airspeed in ice during a climb, then stop the climb right away and initiate a descent to exit the icing conditions to maintain your airspeed. If you ever find yourself in a position where you can't maintain the minimum airspeed in icing, begin a descent and trade altitude for airspeed to avoid a stall. If you've made a request to climb, descend, or turn to exit ice, and there is an ATC delay, request an immediate climb or descent in any direction and express your need to exit the icing conditions. Don't hesitate to declare an emergency if the safety of flight is in question. If you have just entered a cloud and encounter icing conditions, make a 180-degree turn if possible to exit. Above all, maintain your airspeed above minimum airspeed in ice and don't hesitate to declare an emergency if needed.
Going back to the pilot's story at the beginning of this training, you may have noticed that the autopilot was on and holding altitude. But this was at the expense of airspeed as ice accumulated on the airplane. Pilots of small airplanes, particularly when flying alone, should use the autopilot if installed. But all pilots should periodically disconnect the autopilot in significant icing to check controllability. The pilot must also be vigilant and monitor airspeed closely. The FAA is aware of one severe icing encounter with a small turboprop-powered airplane in which 50 knots of airspeed was lost in a little over a minute. When climbing in icing, do not use the vertical speed mode unless explicitly allowed by the AFM.
Pilots of icing certificated aircraft should not be casual about operations in icing conditions, particularly extended operations. You may encounter an unusual condition for which your aircraft has not been certificated, such as liquid water content outside the envelopes. This is sometimes indicated by a very rapid rate of accumulation and can result in runback and ice buildup aft of the protected surfaces. Another, more common icing condition that airplanes have never been certified to is supercooled large drop, or SLD, otherwise known as freezing drizzle and freezing rain. These large drops can form ice farther aft on surfaces, resulting in larger lift and drag penalties. Ice that forms aft of the leading edge protected area is severe icing. You must avoid these conditions, starting with your pre-flight planning. Do not rely on METARs at airports with no human weather observer to report freezing drizzle or any freezing precipitation when snow is falling.
Briefing.
In 2014, the FAA published a new certification rule for transport category airplanes. New transport airplanes will have to show that they can safely operate in SLD or show that they can detect and safely exit SLD. As of 2015, there is a similar rulemaking effort for small airplanes.
After viewing this film, you know that pilots must never be complacent in any icing encounter. The pilots in our opening story successfully managed their flight during icing, but the next icing cloud they fly into may bring different hazards. Each icing encounter is unique. Effectively planning for a safe flight during icing conditions begins on the ground and should include the following steps. Check for icing conditions during pre-flight weather. Know where and when icing may occur, and plan your route to avoid it.
Know your airplane's icing certification. Know whether or not your plane has been evaluated for ice-contaminated tail stall. Consult the date of certification in the TCDS on the FAA website or your airplane manufacturer. In any inadvertent icing encounters, work to get out immediately. Assume higher stall speed, degraded climb performance, and sacrifice altitude for airspeed. Remember to keep your airspeeds up, even if it's necessary to descend to do this. If your AFM has minimum speeds for icing, follow them. If the AFM has no minimum speeds, increase speeds by at least 15%. Periodically turn off autopilot to check for control. If you experience shudder or buffet, it is probably wing stall. Recover by first pushing forward to lower angle of attack. On approach and landing, increase speed and use partially extended flaps or follow the recommendations in your AFM.
Activate your ice protection in accordance with your AFM. This is critical on many airplanes certified since 2000 because activating your ice protection system bumps up your stall warning speed. Since the workload on approach may be high, consider activating your ice protection system when configuring for approach if there is any possibility of icing. In your pre-flight planning, remember the higher operating speeds for icing increase runway length, and your AFM may have lower weight limits.
Inadvertent ice encounters happen. Pilots who inadvertently encounter icing in non-icing certified airplanes can also benefit from the recommendations in this video. In any ice encounter, the most important thing is to be aware. Cross-check airspeed, power setting with instruments, and airplane attitude. If you observe changes in any of these parameters, respond accordingly. If you don't know, find out. Determine if and when your airplane was certificated. Check your AFM for limitations and procedures in icing. If your AFM has none, follow the procedures in this training. Start your awareness in pre-flight weather. Know where the freezing level in cloud tops are. Be aware of your climb performance and that it will be reduced in icing. Be vigilant of your airspeed when in icing conditions when climbing, during cruise, and during approach and landing. If the cruise airspeed continues to decrease while maintaining a level altitude and requires continually increasing power, it is time to consider a descent. Do not let airspeed decrease unabated without pilot action. Remember, when you're in ice, work to get out. If you experience stall, remember that most are wing stalls or should be treated that way. Wing stall recovery must start with pushing forward on the yoke to lower angle of attack while trading altitude for airspeed. Maintaining control of the airplane at all times is an absolute necessity. An off-field controlled landing is better than an uncontrolled crash. Speed is life.